You know what those things were, don't you? Mark asked, his voice raw. Daniel didn't answer right away. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. Finally he said, "You were lucky. They don't usually let people go." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "I've worked these roads for over 10 years. People disappear out here. Hikers, campers, whole groups just like you. No trace left behind. No bodies. Just gone." Sarah let out a small, broken sound. "Oh my God. I don't know what they are," Daniel continued, eyes fixed on the road. "But I know they're real. And I know they don't like being seen." A heavy silence fell over us. The car rumbled along the road, the fog finally beginning to thin. Then Emily stiffened beside me. "Wait." We all turned to look at her. Her face had gone deathly pale, her lips trembling. "The RV," she whispered. "All our stuff is still in there. Our phones, our bags, everything." Mark cursed under his breath. "No way in hell are we going back." I agreed. There was nothing in that RV worth risking our lives for. Daniel didn't even hesitate. "You don't want it back." I looked at him. "Why?" His expression darkened. "Because by morning it won't be there." The car reached the main highway and I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The mist had fully cleared, revealing a stretch of road bathed in the pale glow of the moon. Daniel pulled off onto the shoulder and turned to face us. "You're safe now," he said. "But listen to me, don't talk about this. Not to anyone." I frowned. "Why not?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Because no one will believe you. And because knowing about them, it makes you a target." A fresh wave of fear rolled through me. "Just go home," he said. "Forget this ever happened." Easier said than done. We got out of the car, shaking, exhausted but alive. Daniel gave us one last look before pulling away, his taillights disappearing into the night. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then Sarah broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Emily wiped at her face. "We go home." I nodded, though a sinking feeling had settled deep in my gut. Because I knew, no matter how far we went, no matter how much we tried to forget, they would always be watching. The drive home was eerily quiet. No one spoke, and the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement. Every now and then, Emily would glance over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking in the darkness behind us. I couldn't blame her. My hands were still trembling on the wheel. No matter how far we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against me, crawling over my skin like insects. Mark finally broke the silence. "We tell people, right? We have to warn them." "No," Emily whispered. Mark turned to her, incredulous. "What do you mean, no?" Emily looked at me, her eyes wide and glassy. What if Daniel was right? What if talking about them makes them come back? A heavy silence followed. No one had an answer. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "I just want to go home." I tightened my grip on the wheel and nodded. "Yeah, we all do." But deep down, I knew we'd never truly leave Big Sur behind. When we finally reached our homes, the relief was short-lived. That first night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind sent my heart racing. The shadows in the corners of the room felt darker, deeper. Emily wasn't doing much better. She sat awake by the window, staring out into the empty street. At around 3 a.m., she finally spoke. "Do you think it's over?" I hesitated. "I don't know." She didn't look at me. "I still feel them. Watching." I wanted to tell her she was just imagining it, that everything was fine now. But I couldn't, because I felt it too. The paranoia only grew worse over the next few days. Mark stopped answering our calls. When I finally drove to his apartment, his neighbor said he had packed up and left in the middle of the night. No forwarding address. Sarah wasn't any better. She sent us one last text before blocking our numbers entirely. "I can't do this. I have to forget. Please don't contact me." Emily was right. The further we got from Big Sur, the less we wanted to remember. But the problem was I couldn't forget. It's been 2 weeks now. Emily and I try to act normal, go to work, watch TV, pretend like nothing ever happened. But we know the truth. Something followed us home. At night, we hear soft knocks on the windows, always at exactly 3:33 a.m. When we look outside, there's nothing there. The lights flicker sometimes, and the whispers return in the dead of night, just faint enough to question if we imagine them. Then last night, I woke up to find Emily standing at the bedroom window again, staring out into the darkness. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They're here." I looked outside, my blood running cold. There, at the edge of our yard, stood a single shadowy figure. So silent, watching, just like before. Only this time it wasn't alone. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on it. Emily gripped my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin, but I barely noticed. The figures stood motionless at the edge of our yard, their dark silhouettes barely distinguishable from the night itself. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step back from the window. "We need to leave." Emily shook her head, eyes locked on the figures. "It won't matter. They'll follow." Her voice was empty, hollow, as if she had already accepted something I hadn't. I grabbed her shoulders, trying to snap her out of it. "We can't just stay here and wait for them to come inside." A sharp tap against the window made us both freeze. Slow, deliberate, tap, tap, tap. My heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't want to look, but I had to. One of them had moved. It was right outside the window now, its featureless face pressed against the glass. And though it had no eyes, I knew it was staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Then all at once, every window in the house rattled. A deep, guttural sound reverberated through the walls, something between a growl and a whisper. The air turned frigid. Emily clung to me. "We have to do something." I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock it. I dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear, praying for someone to pick up. Static. Then a voice, low and distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. "You shouldn't have looked." I dropped the phone. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices filling the room, slipping into my mind like tendrils of smoke. The lights flickered wildly, casting frantic shadows against the walls. Then silence. I turned to Emily, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. Her eyes were fixed on the closet door. It was open, and something was inside. A dark shape loomed in the doorway, hunched and unnatural. Its limbs stretched too far, bending at impossible angles. Slowly, it unfolded itself, stepping forward. Emily whimpered, backing away until she hit the wall. My body refused to move. It was inside. A voice, whispering yet deafening, filled the room. "You brought us home." The figure lunged. Everything went black. I woke up in daylight. Emily was gone. The house was silent, empty. The closet door was closed as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. My phone sat on the nightstand, screen cracked. I picked it up, scrolling through the missed calls. The last one was from Mark. One single text sat below it. I saw them too. And beneath that, another message I didn't remember sending. "We never left." The words on the screen made my stomach twist. My fingers trembled as I gripped the phone tighter. "We never left." I didn't remember typing that. I tried calling Mark, but the line was dead. Just static, the same distorted noise I'd heard when I dialed 911. Emily was still missing. The house was too quiet, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I called out for her, my voice cracking. No answer. With shaky steps, I moved through the house, checking every room. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. The sunlight outside looked wrong, like it wasn't reaching the house properly, as if the shadows inside were swallowing it whole. Then I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the bedroom closet. The same closet where it had been. I stopped in my tracks, my pulse thundering in my ears. Then a voice. Emily's voice. "Help me." The sound was weak, muffled, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. But it was definitely Emily. I ran to the closet, hesitating only for a second before yanking the door open. Empty. Just darkness. A hollow, endless void where the back of the closet should have been. My breath came in shallow gasps. This wasn't possible. I reached out, waving my hand in front of me. There was nothing. No wall, no barrier, just blackness stretching beyond comprehension. Then I felt it. A hand. Ice-cold fingers brushed against mine, too long, too thin. I jerked back with a strangled cry, but before I could move, something grabbed my wrist. Emily's voice echoed from within the darkness. "Please, don't leave me." I yanked my arm back with all my strength, falling onto the floor. The closet door slammed shut on its own, rattling violently as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, my heartbeat pounding in my skull. Then the whispering started again. Not from the closet, from behind me. Slowly I turned around. The figures were inside the house now, standing in the hallway, in the kitchen, by the front door. Dozens of them, their featureless faces turned toward me, watching. The closest one stepped forward, its head tilted slightly, its elongated fingers twitching. "You brought us home," it whispered. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The air around me felt like it had thickened, pressing against my lungs, my limbs. The thing reached out, placing a single cold hand on my shoulder. Darkness crept into the edges of my vision, like ink spilling across a page. The last thing I heard before everything went black was Emily's voice. Soft, distant. "You should have never stopped the RV." Emily grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. The firelight only stretched so far, leaving deep shadows just outside our circle. Then came another sound, a slow, deliberate step. Sarah inhaled sharply. "It's just an animal, right?" Mark, ever the skeptic, stood up. "I'll check it out." "Mark, don't." Emily hissed, but he was already moving, stepping just beyond the glow of the fire. The darkness swallowed him. We held our breath. The seconds dragged, stretching into an unbearable silence. Then suddenly Mark screamed. The sound was raw, filled with terror unlike anything I had ever heard. He came stumbling back into the light, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. "There's something out there," he gasped. "I don't know what it is, but..." A loud snap cut him off. Something big was moving in the woods. That's when I saw it again. The figure, standing just beyond the firelight, watching. And this time it took a step closer. The knock echoed through the RV, slow and deliberate. My breath hitched as my fingers tightened around the steering wheel, though I knew it was useless now. The engine was dead. Emily whimpered beside me. "It's here." Mark scrambled for anything he could use as a weapon, finally grabbing a heavy flashlight from the dashboard. Sarah buried her face in her hands, her body trembling. The knock came again. This time it was louder, closer. I turned my head toward the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. Through the thin curtain covering the window, I could see the faint outline of something standing there. It was taller than I remembered, its form distorted, like a shadow stretching against the fabric of reality. Then came the worst part. It spoke. Not in words, not in any language I recognized. The sound was a mixture of whispers, overlapping voices that slithered through the air, seeping into my skull like poison. My vision blurred. My head throbbed. Emily clutched my arm. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here." Mark stepped toward the door, raising the flashlight. "If it gets in, I'm not going down without a fight." Sarah let out a choked sob. "Don't open it, Mark. Please." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think. The RV was useless now, we had to run. But running into the woods? That was almost worse. Another knock. More forceful this time. The door handle twisted. "No." Emily gasped, reaching for it as if she could somehow stop whatever was outside from coming in. I lunged forward, grabbing the handle and holding it down with all my strength. Something on the other side pressed against the door, pushing. The metal groaned under the strain. "Out the back," I hissed. Mark hesitated, but when the door jerked violently, he sprang into action. He yanked Sarah to her feet, dragging her toward the rear exit. Emily was right behind them. I took one last glance at the door. A shadow moved behind the curtain. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, pressed against the thin fabric. It had no mouth, yet I swore I could still hear it whispering. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and ran. We burst out of the RV and into the cold night air. The mist swirled thick around us, limiting our vision. The towering trees seemed to loom even closer, their gnarled branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. "Which way?" Mark hissed. "The road." I gasped, already sprinting toward it. The whispering grew louder behind us. I didn't dare look back. Sarah tripped, letting out a small cry. Emily grabbed her arm, yanking her up just as a dark shape flickered through the fog behind us. We ran, faster than I ever thought possible. The mist curled around our legs, thick as smoke. The road stretched ahead, but it felt endless, as if we were running in place. Then I heard it. Not the whispers this time. Footsteps. Many of them. A quick glance over my shoulder sent my stomach plummeting. They were following us. The shadowy figures, dozens of them, moving unnaturally fast, their limbs stretching in impossible ways. "We're not gonna make it," Sarah sobbed. "Yes, we are." I forced out, though my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Then, ahead of us, something changed. A pair of headlights appeared through the fog, bright, piercing. A car. Hope surged in my chest. I waved frantically, screaming, "Help! Help!" The vehicle skidded to a stop, and a man jumped out, his face lined with confusion and concern. "What the?" But he didn't need to finish his sentence. He saw them, the figures in the mist. "Get in," he shouted. We didn't hesitate. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut just as the figures reached the edge of the headlights. And then they stopped, standing at the edge of the light, watching, unmoving. As the car sped away, I finally exhaled, my body trembling. But deep down, I knew the truth. We had escaped. For now. Silence filled the car, broken only by the heavy breathing of everyone inside. The man driving kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he muttered. I shook my head, still struggling to form words. I don't know." Emily was curled up against me, her whole body trembling. Sarah sat beside her, staring blankly ahead, her face wet with tears. Mark was gripping the edge of his seat so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The headlights pierced through the mist as we sped down the winding road. The figures were gone now, swallowed by the darkness behind us. After what felt like an eternity, the man spoke again. "My name's Daniel," he said. "I'm a park ranger. I was making my last rounds when I saw your RV back there." He looked at me. "What were you all doing out here this late?" I swallowed hard. "We were camping." He shook his head. "Not here. Not at night." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I woke up gasping for air. For a moment, I thought I was dead. But as my vision adjusted, I realized I was lying on my bed. Our bed. Morning light streamed in through the window, golden and warm, as if last night had never happened. But I knew better. Emily was still missing. The closet door was open just a crack, and I swore I could still feel something lurking behind it, watching. I forced myself to move, to swing my legs over the side of the bed. My entire body ached like I had run for miles. My hands were ice cold, and when I looked down, faint bruises circled my wrist, exactly where something had grabbed me. A chill ran through me. I needed to find Emily. I stood up too fast, my head swimming. My phone was still on the nightstand, the cracked screen reflecting the morning light. I reached for it, praying that whatever force had been messing with it was gone. One new message. From an unknown number. "Did you dream it? Or did it dream you?" My blood ran cold. The house felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against my skin like a living thing. The walls looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I reached out to touch them, my hand would sink right through. I walked down the hall, calling for Emily. Silence. I checked every room. The kitchen. The bathroom. Even the basement. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. The RV keys were sitting on the kitchen counter. I knew for a fact they hadn't been there last night. A lump formed in my throat. The last time I saw those keys, they were in the ignition, right before we abandoned the RV in the middle of Big Sur. I picked them up with shaking fingers. The moment I did, the lights flickered. A whisper crawled through the air, soft as a breath against my ear. "Come back." I spun around. No one was there. But the front door was open. Outside, the street was empty. No cars. No people. Just a dull, gray stillness, like the world had been frozen in time. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I should have stayed inside. I should have slammed the door shut and never looked back. But I didn't. I stepped onto the porch. The air smelled different, damp, earthy, wrong. Like the forest, like Big Sur. The wind shifted. The mist rolled in. And there, standing at the edge of my driveway, was the RV, perfectly intact, waiting. The whispering returned, swirling around me in hushed, overlapping voices. We never left. The figure stood beside it now, just like before, watching, waiting. And then, behind me, a voice I knew too well. "Emily, come inside, love. It's time to go." I turned, and the world went black. I awoke to the gentle hum of an engine. Blinking, I sat up, my body stiff and aching. The air was thick with the familiar scent of pine and salt. My hands trembled as I reached for the seatbelt strapped across my chest. I was in the RV. The same RV we had abandoned in Big Sur. Emily sat in the passenger seat beside me, her face calm, almost serene. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting mine. But something was wrong. Her pupils were too large. Her skin was too pale. Her lips curled into a small smile, but it wasn't her smile. "You're awake," she said softly. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my pulse hammering. I turned my head slightly, glancing into the rearview mirror. Mark and Sarah sat behind us, perfectly still. Their eyes were open, but they didn't blink, didn't move. "Where?" My voice cracked. "Where are we going?" Emily's smile widened, but she didn't answer. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and endless. And the road ahead. It wasn't a road at all. It was just darkness. Panic surged through me. I reached for the door handle, yanking at it desperately. Locked. The windows wouldn't budge either. "Emily," I gasped. "Let me out." She simply watched me, tilting her head slightly. "Why would you want to leave?" "We're going home." Home. The word made my stomach churn. I turned in my seat, looking at Mark and Sarah again. "Guys, we have to get out of here." Neither of them responded. Then, ever so slowly, Mark's lips parted. "You shouldn't have stopped the RV," he whispered. Sarah turned her head toward me in perfect synchronization, her movements stiff, unnatural. We never left. My breath hitched. Then I saw it. Through the windshield, standing in the distance, just barely visible through the fog. The figures. They were waiting. And the RV was driving straight toward them. I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged for the wheel. The moment my hands touched it, the entire RV shuddered. Emily let out a sharp hiss, her head snapping toward me with unnatural speed. "Don't." But I didn't stop. I yanked the wheel hard to the side. The RV lurched violently. The tires screeched. The world outside spun as the vehicle swerved, the fog swallowing everything whole. And then, impact. A deafening crash. Glass shattered. My body slammed against the dashboard. Pain exploded through my ribs as the world tilted and spun. Then silence. The next thing I knew, I was lying in the dirt, the cold air biting into my skin. My head throbbed. The scent of gasoline filled my nostrils. I forced my eyes open. The RV was wrecked, its front end crumpled against a massive redwood tree. Smoke curled from the engine. Emily was gone. Mark and Sarah were gone. I was alone, or so I thought, because when I turned my head, the figures were standing in a circle around me, closer than ever, watching. I couldn't move. The figures loomed over me, their hollow faces expressionless, yet I could feel their gaze pressing into my skin. The air was thick with silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing but the weight of their presence. Then one of them stepped forward. I wanted to scream, to crawl away, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. The figure crouched down inches from my face. Up close, it was worse. Its shape wasn't solid, but shifting like smoke trapped in the form of a person. It raised one long, skeletal hand and pressed it against my chest. Cold. So impossibly cold. Whispers slithered into my ears, overlapping voices I couldn't understand. But one word came through clearly. Stay. A sharp pain bloomed in my chest. I gasped, choking on air, my vision blurring at the edges. It was pulling me, dragging me into the darkness with it. No. I clenched my jaw, forcing my body to move. My fingers clawed at the dirt beneath me, desperate for something to hold on to. Then, a voice. Not a whisper, but Emily's voice. Run. The pressure on my chest lifted. I gasped, sucking in a ragged breath, and before I could even process what was happening, my body moved. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. The figures didn't chase me. They only stood there, their featureless faces turned toward me, watching. Emily's voice had come from nowhere, from everywhere, but she was gone. I stumbled backward, my pulse hammering. The RV was destroyed, the road was nowhere to be seen, and the mist had thickened around me, swallowing the trees. I was lost. The only thing I could do was run. So I did. I sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at my arms, my breath ragged in my throat. The mist shifted around me, moving unnaturally like it was alive. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. Time felt strange, like I was moving in circles, trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. But then, just as my legs threatened to give out, I saw it. A light, flickering between the trees. Hope surged through me and I pushed forward, ignoring the burning in my lungs. As I got closer, the mist began to thin, and the outline of a small ranger station came into view. My salvation. I burst through the door, collapsing onto the wooden floor. The warmth of a fire crackled nearby, and a startled voice shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" I looked up. A ranger stood over me, concern in his eyes. He knelt down, gripping my shoulder. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out in a rasp. Figures, shadows, they... His expression darkened. He stood abruptly, moving to lock the door. "You saw them," he muttered under his breath. I blinked, my body still shaking. "You know what they are?" The ranger didn't answer right away. He only exhaled slowly, staring at the window. "They always come back," he said. Then he turned to me, his face grim. "And now so will you." The ranger's words sent a chill through me. I tried to catch my breath, but something felt off. The warmth of the ranger station didn't feel comforting, it felt suffocating. Outside, the mist still swirled between the trees, shifting like it had a mind of its own. Then I noticed something. The distant hum of the world, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, was gone. A deep, unnatural silence had settled over everything. The ranger moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. His shoulders tensed. His fingers twitched toward the rifle strapped to his back. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he muttered under his breath, "It's starting." My stomach nodded. "What's starting?" That's when I heard it. A low, guttural moan. Not from the forest. From the town. The ranger turned to me, his face grim. "Listen to me. Whatever you do, don't make a sound." But it was too late. From outside, the groaning grew louder. Then came the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet, thousands of them, dragging across pavement. I swallowed hard and moved toward the window, peering out. The mist had thinned just enough for me to see the highway leading into town. The glow of streetlights flickered in the distance. Shadows moved beneath them, hundreds, no, thousands of people staggering forward in eerie unison. Their movements were jerky, unnatural. Their heads lolled to one side, their mouths hanging open. Some of them twitched, others dragged themselves forward with unnatural strength. Their eyes were empty. The city had changed. It wasn't just the figures from the forest anymore. Everyone was turning into them. Panic clawed at my throat. What the hell is happening? The ranger grabbed a shotgun from the wall, loading it with smooth, practiced movements. I don't know how, but it spread. He looked at me, his face hard. It started in the woods, but now it's in the town. And if it's there, it won't stop. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering. Is there a way out? The ranger hesitated. Then finally he shook his head. Maybe. But if we're gonna survive, we need to move now. Outside, the first wave of them had reached the edge of the forest. Some of them wandered between the trees, their slow, aimless steps crunching against the fallen leaves. One of them stopped, turned its head, and looked right at me. Its jaw unhinged, stretching too wide. A choked, garbled noise gurgled from its throat. Then, it charged. The creature slammed against the window with bone-cracking force. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The glass shuddered but didn't break, yet. The ranger was already moving, shotgun raised. That's not just a zombie, he muttered, eyes locked on the thing clawing at the window. I barely had time to register his words before the moaning outside intensified. More figures emerged from the mist, their movements erratic, twitching as if something inside them was struggling to take control. Then I saw him. Mark, or what used to be Mark. He stood among them, his body rigid, taller than before. His eyes were completely black, voids of shifting darkness. Thick, shadowy tendrils pulsed beneath his skin, moving like living veins. He wasn't just another infected. He was leading them. The realization hit me like ice in my veins. Mark, the biggest skeptic, the one who laughed at our fears, had become the host. The Shadow Watcher had taken him, twisted him, and now he was bringing them here. I turned to the ranger. We have to kill him. The ranger's jaw tightened. We'll be lucky if we survive. Mark's head tilted in an unnatural way, as if he had heard me through the glass. His lips stretched into a grin too wide, too sharp. The tendrils beneath his skin twitched, and suddenly, he moved. Not staggered, not walked. He vanished into the mist and reappeared right in front of the cabin door. Before I could react, the wooden door exploded inward. The force sent me sprawling backward. The ranger fired his shotgun. Once, twice, but Mark barely flinched. The wounds in his chest oozed black smoke instead of blood. A tendril lashed out, wrapping around the ranger's leg. He cried out as he was yanked forward, his weapon clattering to the ground. I lunged for it. My fingers closed around the shotgun's handle just as Mark turned to me, his hollow eyes gleaming. "You can't fight it," he whispered. His voice wasn't his anymore. It was layered, overlapping, filled with voices I didn't recognize. Then the whispers in my head began again. "Join us." I pressed the shotgun against Mark's chest and pulled the trigger. The blast sent him staggering backward, black smoke hissing from the wound. He let out a low, guttural laugh. "You don't understand," he rasped, his form flickering like a dying flame. "I am the door now. The Shadow Watcher is here." Then the walls breathed. The entire cabin trembled. The shadows stretched, elongated, shifting into gaping, hungry maws. The figures outside pushed forward, their bodies convulsing as the darkness swallowed them whole. The ranger, still on the ground, grabbed my wrist. His eyes were wild, desperate. "We can't stop it. We run." The whispers turned into a roar inside my skull. My vision blurred. Mark's body began to dissolve into the shadows, his form unraveling. But before he disappeared completely, his lips moved one last time. "See you soon." Then the world around me collapsed. The world around me twisted. The air itself felt wrong, heavy, suffocating, filled with whispers that weren't spoken aloud but felt deep in my bones. Then came the screaming. I stumbled outside with the ranger, my legs barely able to support me. The town below was no longer just a city, it was a battlefield of monsters. The zombies, if that's what they even were anymore, were attacking each other. I watched in horror as one of them, Its skin stretched thin over shifting shadows, lunged at another, tearing into its flesh like a rabid animal. But instead of blood, black smoke poured from the wound, twisting and latching onto its attacker like living chains. It wasn't a fight. The road twisted like a serpent through the towering redwoods, the dense canopy above allowing only fractured beams of sunlight to touch the damp pavement. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as our RV rumbled along the desolate highway leading into Big Sur State Park. The air outside was thick with the scent of pine and salt, an eerie combination that sent a shiver down my spine. We had planned this trip for months, just me, my wife Emily, and our two friends Mark and Sarah. The idea was simple, a weekend of camping, disconnecting from the world and immersing ourselves in nature. But as we neared our destination, an unshakable feeling of unease crept into my chest. "You okay?" Emily asked from the passenger seat, her voice gentle but laced with concern. "Yeah," I forced a smile. I don't know, something feels off." Mark, sprawled out on the RV's couch behind me, chuckled. "Dude, you've been watching too many horror movies. It's just the woods." Sarah, sitting beside him, peered out the window. "It does feel kinda isolated," she admitted, "like we're the only people out here." The GPS indicated we were only a few miles from our designated campsite, but as we drove deeper into the park, the road became narrower, the trees pressing in from both sides. A mist had begun to settle, thick and unnatural, obscuring the road ahead. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. Just barely visible through the mist, its outline was unnaturally still, almost too still to be human. My heart thudded against my ribs as I instinctively slowed the RV. "What is it?" Emily asked, following my gaze. But by the time she looked, the figure was gone. I swallowed hard and pressed my foot gently on the accelerator, urging the RV forward. The air inside felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension. "Probably just a trick of the fog," I muttered, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded, turning back toward the windshield. Mark and Sarah, however, were less concerned. "Maybe it was a ranger," Mark suggested. "Or some hiker just passing through." Sarah shuddered. "Then why didn't they move?" No one had an answer for that. We finally reached our campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering redwoods, with just enough space to park the RV and set up a fire pit. As I cut the engine, silence fell around us. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind whistling through the trees like a distant whisper. Mark clapped his hands. "All right, let's get set up. We're not gonna let some creepy forest vibes ruin the weekend, right?" My breath caught in my throat. The figure was clearer now, a tall, shadowy form with elongated limbs, its face obscured by the darkness. But I could feel its gaze, piercing and cold. Emily grabbed my hand, her fingers digging into my skin. "We need to leave," she whispered. Mark was shaking, his earlier bravado shattered. It moved. It was right behind me. Sarah looked like she was on the verge of tears. "We can't just stay here." Another snap of a branch. Then a low, guttural sound, like a breath exhaled from the void itself. The fire flickered violently, as if something unseen had disturbed the air around it. I made a split-second decision. Get in the RV. Now. No one argued. We scrambled toward the vehicle, practically shoving each other through the door. I jumped into the driver's seat and fumbled for the keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped them. Then Emily screamed. I turned just in time to see a dark, clawed hand press against the window beside her. The fingers were impossibly long, their nails sharp and jagged. They scraped slowly down the glass, leaving behind deep, unnatural grooves. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life. The RV lurched forward as I slammed my foot on the gas. Gravel sprayed behind us as we tore out of the campsite, the headlights illuminating nothing but swirling mist and the twisted trunks of redwoods. Mark was hyperventilating, clutching his chest. What the hell was that? Sarah was curled into a ball, her arms wrapped around her knees. Emily kept glancing at the windows as if expecting to see that thing peering in again. I drove blindly down the narrow road, my only goal being to put as much distance between us and whatever had been out there. But the mist had thickened, swallowing the trees, making it nearly impossible to see. Then the RV jerked violently. It felt like we had hit something large. The steering wheel wrenched from my hands and the entire vehicle skidded sideways. I fought to regain control, my heart pounding, sweat dripping down my face. A shape loomed in the mist ahead. I slammed the brakes. The RV came to a shuddering stop just inches away from a figure standing in the middle of the road. But this time it wasn't alone. There were more of them. Dozens of shadowy forms, lining the road, unmoving, their hollow eyes locked onto us. "No, no, no," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the thundering beat of my heart. I threw the RV into reverse, my foot pressing hard on the pedal. The tires screeched against the pavement as we shot backward. The figures remained motionless, watching. Then they started moving. Not walking, gliding. Sliding toward us with unnatural ease, their dark forms shifting and flickering like living shadows. Sarah let out a sob. "They're coming." Mark banged his fist against the dashboard. "Drive faster." I swerved onto a side road, barely managing to keep the RV steady. The mist parted for just a moment, revealing the path ahead. A winding road that led down the mountain back toward the main highway. Hope flared in my chest. If we could just get out of the forest. But then the headlights flickered. The engine sputtered. And the RV died. Complete silence. We sat frozen, too afraid to breathe. Then from outside came a single deliberate knock on the door. We all agreed, albeit half-heartedly. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, the orange glow flickering across our faces. Mark pulled out a cooler, handing out drinks, while Sarah poked at the fire with a stick. "I read that Big Sur has some weird legends," she said suddenly. Emily frowned. "Like what?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "There's this story about a spirit. Some people call it the Shadow Watcher. Supposedly, it appears to lost travelers standing still at the edge of the woods, just watching." A chill ran down my spine. Mark laughed. "Come on, that's just some campfire tale." Sarah shrugged. "Maybe." But then we heard it. A rustling from the darkness beyond the firelight. We all froze. The crackling of the fire suddenly felt deafening against the eerie quiet of the forest. It was assimilation. "They're consuming each other," the ranger muttered, his grip tightening on his shotgun. I looked at him. "Why?" His expression darkened. "Because whatever's inside them, it's competing to be in control." Down below, more creatures clashed, their bodies warping, limbs stretching unnaturally as they fused and grew. The ones that survived the fights were bigger, stronger, their voices a chorus of overlapping whispers. And at the center of it all, Mark stood watching. Mark, if he could still be called that, was no longer human. His body had fully merged with the shadows, his limbs elongated, his face a shifting void. Tendrils of darkness stretched from his form, latching onto the strongest of the remaining creatures, absorbing them. With every zombie that fell, Mark became more. I took a step back, my pulse hammering. "We have to stop him." The ranger shook his head. "We can't." A sudden screech split the air. One of the remaining zombies, its body bloated with shifting tendrils, let out an unearthly howl and charged straight at Mark. For a brief second, I thought it might stand a chance. But Mark barely moved. As the creature lunged, his tendrils reacted, shooting forward like spears, piercing through the attacker's chest. The thing convulsed, its body collapsing inward as Mark absorbed it entirely. When the smoke cleared, Mark was bigger, stronger. He turned, and for the first time, his empty gaze landed directly on us. He had been watching us the whole time. A deep rumbling sound filled the air, not from the ground, but from inside Mark. His body trembled, vibrating with energy. The remaining zombies, what few were left, fell silent. Then Mark spoke. Not in words, not in a voice. His whispers slithered through the air, touching every living thing, creeping into my mind like oil sinking into water. Join or be consumed. I staggered, gripping my head as an unbearable pressure filled my skull. Beside me, the ranger groaned, dropping to one knee. Mark raised a hand. The remaining creatures, those he hadn't absorbed, began moving toward him, their bodies breaking down, shifting, becoming part of him. He was merging with all of them, becoming something else. "No," I whispered. The ranger grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "We have to run, now." But it was too late. Mark had finished evolving, and the Shadow Watcher had fully taken its new form. The thing that had once been Mark moved. Not like a man, not anymore. His body rippled, shifting with unnatural fluidity, his limbs elongating, stretching out like writhing smoke. The last remnants of his human form had vanished, replaced by something far worse. Something ancient. Something hungry. The remaining creatures knelt before him, their twitching, grotesque forms submitting without hesitation. Those that were too weak to follow simply melted into the ground, their black essence slithering toward Mark, feeding him. The air vibrated with a low, pulsing hum, like the heartbeat of something massive awakening beneath the earth. Then, without warning, every single one of the remaining creatures turned to us. Their hollow eyes locked onto our shaking forms. The ranger's grip tightened on his shotgun. "This is it," he muttered. I swallowed hard. "We can't fight them. We're not going to." He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. A detonator. I stared at him. "You had explosives this whole time?" He gave me a grim smile. "Didn't think I'd need them inside city limits." Then he pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the street, a wave of fire and force shattering windows, tearing through buildings. A massive boom echoed into the mist-covered sky, followed by a second blast, then a third. The ground trembled beneath us as the blast radius expanded. The ranger had planted the charges well. Gas lines ignited, cars erupted into fireballs, entire sections of the street collapsed inward. The creature screamed, not in pain but in rage. Mark, or the thing that had become Mark, staggered back as the flames engulfed his minions. His tendrils lashed wildly, trying to reclaim them, but the fire was too strong, consuming the shadows before they could slither back to him. For the first time he looked vulnerable. The ranger grabbed my arm. "Run." We bolted, dodging through the burning wreckage, leaping over bodies, both human and not. The creatures still standing tried to give chase, but the fire cut them off, trapping them in a wall of searing heat. I dared one last look over my shoulder. Mark was changing again. His form writhed, desperate, as if trying to escape. But the fire had him now. His tendrils recoiled, curling inward, his hollow eyes burning as his body collapsed in on itself. Then he was gone. We didn't stop running until we reached the outskirts of the city. The fires behind us raged on, thick black smoke curling into the sky. The streets were eerily empty now. No more figures, no more whispers. The Shadow Watcher's army had been eradicated. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. My hands were shaking, my entire body coated in ash and sweat. The ranger stood beside me, staring at the inferno in silence. His face was unreadable. Finally he spoke. "It's over." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew better. Something as powerful as the Shadow Watcher didn't just die. It retreated. It waited. And somewhere, in some forgotten part of the world, it was already looking for a new host. For now the city was safe. But the nightmare wasn't over. It would never be over. The flames burned for hours. We sat in silence, watching the city smolder from a distance. The once thriving streets were now nothing but ruins, flickering with the last embers of destruction. No movement, no screams, just an eerie, unnatural stillness. The ranger finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "We should keep moving." I barely had the energy to nod. My body felt like it had been wrung dry, my mind refusing to process what we had just survived. "We don't know if any of them made it out," he continued. "We don't know if it made it out." I swallowed. "Mark?" The ranger didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. "Whatever was left of your friend died back there." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I wasn't sure, because when I closed my eyes I could still hear the whispers, and they were getting louder. We traveled for miles, putting as much distance between us and the city as possible. The roads were eerily empty, lined with abandoned cars and signs of panic. Whatever had happened in the city had spread fast, too fast. It wasn't just a disaster, it was an erasure. No bodies, no survivors, just silence. As night fell, we found shelter in an old gas station on the edge of a forgotten highway. The windows were shattered, the aisles ransacked. The only light came from a flickering neon sign, buzzing weakly in the cold air. The ranger pulled out a map, spreading it across the counter. If we follow this route, we might find help. If there's any help left, I muttered. He didn't argue. I grabbed a bottle of water from the floor, my hands shaking as I twisted the cap. I hadn't realized how thirsty I was. Then, just as I took a sip, a soft tap echoed from the front window. I froze. The ranger reached for his gun. Don't move. We turned, our eyes locked on the glass. Outside, in the dim glow of the neon light, a single figure stood. Still, silent, watching. My breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought it was another survivor. Someone lost, wandering, looking for help. But then I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. The figure was featureless, its skin smooth, void-like. Its arms hung at unnatural angles, its fingers twitching in slow, deliberate movements. The ranger cursed under his breath. Not again. The figure took a step forward. The neon light above flickered violently, casting jagged shadows against the pavement. My pulse pounded. Then the whispers returned. Not outside, inside. They slithered into my skull, filling the air like 1,000 voices overlapping. We never left. My body locked up. The gas station suddenly felt smaller, darker, the walls closing in. The ranger grabbed my arm. We run, now. I turned to follow him, but the figure was already at the door. And this time it wasn't alone. Sarah had known. She hadn't said anything at the time, but I could see it now. The way she avoided Mark on the drive back from Big Sur, the way she flinched when he spoke, how her eyes darted toward him when she thought no one was looking. She knew. She had felt it before any of us. Mark had been different ever since that night in the forest. We thought it was just exhaustion, just paranoia. But Sarah had sensed what we hadn't. Mark had never truly left Big Sur. The thing inside him had followed us back, wearing his skin, speaking in his voice. And now Mark wasn't just gone. He had become something else. A monster. The gas station door burst open. Mark, or whatever he had become, stood in the doorway, his towering frame barely recognizable. His skin pulsed, shifting with dark tendrils that coiled and twisted like living things. His eyes were black voids, hollow yet filled with something ancient, something hungry. Sarah let out a sharp gasp. He's not Mark anymore. Emily grabbed my hand, her grip so tight it hurt. We have to go. Mark stepped forward, his voice layered, distorted. You brought me back. The shadows stretched beneath him, creeping toward us, clawing across the floor like living veins. Sarah reacted first. She grabbed a shelf and yanked it down, sending cans and bottles crashing onto the floor between us and Mark. Run, she screamed. We didn't hesitate. We bolted through the back door, our feet pounding against the cold pavement as we sprinted into the night. Mark let out an unnatural screech, and the walls of the gas station trembled. The lights exploded above us, showering the alleyway in sparks. We kept running. The town was a graveyard. Abandoned cars, flickering streetlights, buildings half consumed by creeping shadows. Whatever had started in Big Sur had swallowed this place whole. And Mark was right behind us. His footsteps weren't normal. They were everywhere, echoing from the walls, from the rooftops, from the darkness itself. Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. There. The highway. If we could reach the highway, we could find a car, escape, survive. But the second we turned the corner, Mark was there. He didn't run. He shifted, appearing ahead of us in the blink of an eye. His mouth stretched too wide, a grin splitting his face. You can't run. The shadows lashed out. I barely had time to react before one of them wrapped around my ankle, yanking me off my feet. I hit the pavement hard, pain exploding through my ribs. Emily screamed. Sarah grabbed my arms, pulling me up just as another tendril lashed toward us. We barely dodged it, and then we ran again, gasping, bleeding, desperate, because we knew the truth now. We weren't running from Mark anymore. We were running from the Shadow Watcher itself. We ran without direction, only knowing one thing: we had to get away. The town twisted around us, streets looping back on themselves, alleys stretching longer than they should have. The darkness was alive, shifting, closing in. Mark's laughter echoed from the shadows. "You can't run forever," his voice whispered, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah yanked me forward. "Don't listen. Keep moving." Emily was sobbing, her breath ragged. "Where do we go?" I didn't know. The highway had been a dead end. Every street led back into the heart of the town where it was waiting. Then Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. The church. Its doors were open, the inside bathed in dim candlelight. It was the only place untouched by the creeping shadows. "Go!" I shouted. We sprinted inside. As soon as we crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. The doors slammed shut behind us. The silence was deafening. I turned, half expecting Mark to be right behind us. But he wasn't. The outside world was shrouded in darkness, but something was holding it back. Emily collapsed onto one of the pews, shaking. "Why here? Why is this place safe?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She was staring at the altar, her eyes wide. "It's not safe. It's just a pause." I followed her gaze. The church was old, too old. The walls were covered in faded carvings, depictions of figures shrouded in mist, their eyes hollow. The Shadow Watcher. It had been here before. I felt sick. "This isn't just a church." Sarah nodded. "It's a warning." Then the candles flickered. The air grew cold. And Mark's voice whispered from the rafters above. "You think you found sanctuary?" The walls began to move. The carvings on the walls shifted, the hollow-eyed figures twisting, turning their heads toward us. The church groaned, its foundation trembling as if something beneath it was waking up. Sarah grabbed my wrist. "We need to go." Emily was frozen in place, staring up at the ceiling. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Mark was there, hanging upside down from the rafters, his body elongated, his face twisted into something no longer human. "I told you," he whispered, his grin stretching too wide. "You can't run." The doors blew open. The darkness outside surged forward, flooding the church. Mark dropped from the rafters. We ran. The darkness rushed into the church like a living thing, swallowing the candlelight, stretching across the walls like grasping fingers. Sarah grabbed Emily's arm, yanking her toward the side door. "Go. Now." Mark moved, not ran, not jumped, but shifted, his body flickering between places. 1 second he was above us. The next he was by the altar. Then right behind me. I felt his breath on my neck. "You brought me here," he whispered, his voice layered, distorted. "Let me bring you back." I shoved forward, nearly falling as I ran. Emily and Sarah had made it to the side door, their silhouettes barely visible against the faint moonlight outside. The shadows twisted, reaching for me. Mark's form blurred, shifting, lunging. I barely made it through before Sarah slammed the door shut behind me. For a second, silence. Then, bang. Mark hit the door with unnatural force, the wood splintering inward. The entire building shook. "We have to keep moving." Emily sobbed. "We can't." The door burst apart. Mark crawled through the shattered frame, his limbs bending wrong, his empty eyes locked onto us. We ran. The graveyard behind the church was a maze of crumbling tombstones and twisted trees. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the entire town was pressing down on us. Sarah gasped, pointing ahead. "The road. If we can make it to the..." Mark appeared in front of her. His form twisted, shadows peeling off his skin like smoke. His grin never faded. Nowhere left to run. Sarah skidded to a stop, stumbling backward. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a broken branch from a dead tree, and swung. It hit him, square in the chest. But instead of flesh, I struck something wrong. The wood sank into him like he wasn't fully solid, like he was more shadow than body. Mark's expression twitched. For the first time, his grin faltered. Sarah's eyes widened. "Keys." Mark screamed. The air around him rippled, the darkness around us shaking. Then, in the distance, a horn. A car. Headlights pierced through the trees. Someone was coming. The road was so close. I grabbed Emily's hand and ran, dragging her with me. Sarah followed, her breath ragged. Mark shrieked behind us, his form distorting, twisting, his limbs stretching like something unraveling. The headlights got brighter, closer. Then the screech of tires. A truck slammed to a stop right in front of us. The driver, a man in a ranger uniform, threw open the door. "Get in." We didn't hesitate. I shoved Emily inside first, then Sarah before scrambling in myself. Mark lunged. The ranger hit the gas. The truck roared forward, its tires kicking up dust and gravel. Mark's outstretched fingers just missed the tailgate, his body flickering, his screams swallowed by the night. I looked back. The church, the graveyard, the town. All of it was vanishing into the mist. Mark stood there, his body warping, his empty eyes following us. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, he was gone. The truck sped down the broken road, the headlights slicing through the dense fog. None of us spoke. Emily was curled up beside me, her fingers gripping my arms so tightly they left marks. Sarah sat stiffly in the back seat, her wide eyes staring out the window, as if expecting Mark to appear in the mist at any second. The ranger kept his eyes on the road, his hands tight on the wheel. He looked grim, like he had seen things worse than we had. Finally, I found my voice. "Who are you?" The ranger exhaled slowly. "Name's Carter." He glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "I've seen this before." Sarah snapped her head toward him. "What? You knew this could happen?" Carter nodded once. "I've been tracking disappearances around Big Sur for years. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how bad it had gotten." His fingers tightened around the wheel. "But Mark, he's different." A chill crawled down my spine. "What do you mean?" Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he said, "You need to tell me everything that happened back there." So I did. By the time I finished, the road had widened, and the mist had started to thin. The first hints of morning stretched across the sky, but it didn't feel like dawn. It felt like we had survived something we weren't meant to survive. Carter exhaled, his face pale in the dim light. "The Shadow Watcher," he muttered. Sarah flinched at the name. "That's real?" Carter nodded. "It's older than any of us. No one knows where it came from, but it doesn't just kill." He glanced at me. "It inhabits. It waits. It spreads." Emily spoke for the first time, her voice hollow. Mark brought it back. Carter's grip on the wheel tightened. "No," he shook his head. Mark was brought back. That thing inside him? It wasn't done yet. Silence filled the truck. Sarah swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Carter didn't answer. Not at first. Then he finally said, "You don't stop something like this. You run." But I knew. Deep down I knew. We weren't just running from Mark. We weren't just running from the Shadow Watcher. We were running from something bigger. And something told me, no matter how far we drove, no matter how far we tried to escape, this wasn't over. Not yet. Emily shifted beside me, staring out the window. Her breath hitched. "Stop the truck." Carter frowned. "What?" She turned to me, her face pale. "There's someone standing on the road." I followed her gaze. Up ahead, just barely visible in the thinning mist, a lone figure stood in the middle of the highway. So, silent, watching. Carter slammed the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, tires screeching against the pavement. We all stared ahead, frozen. The figure stood in the center of the road, motionless. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't even human. Its body was wrapped in shifting darkness, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was featureless, just a smooth, hollow void where eyes and a mouth should have been. The Shadow Watcher. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath. "No, we got away, we escaped." Carter reached for his shotgun. "Nobody moves." The moment he said it, the thing twitched. Then it stepped forward. Not walking, gliding. The moment its foot touched the ground, the road around it cracked, like reality itself was breaking apart. Emily whimpered beside me, clutching my arm. "It's not supposed to be here. It was supposed to stay in Big Sur." Carter cocked his shotgun, but his hands were shaking. "It followed us." The figure took another step, then another, and then suddenly it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the mist, dozens of them. No faces, no voices, just watching, waiting. The air around us shuddered, like a silent scream pressing against my skull. My vision blurred, my ears rang with a high-pitched noise just on the edge of hearing. Sarah clutched her head, gasping. "It's inside my mind." Emily whimpered, rocking back and forth. We need to leave." But Carter wasn't moving. He just stared ahead, his face pale, his grip on the shotgun loosening. "They're not attacking," he muttered. I forced myself to focus. He was right. The figures weren't moving toward us. They just stood there watching. I swallowed hard. Then what do they want? A whisper slithered through the air. Not from outside. From inside my head. "Return him to us." My stomach twisted. "Mark." The shadow watcher didn't answer. It only waited. And deep down I already knew the truth. We had stolen something from it. And it wanted him back. The truck was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Carter did something I didn't expect. He opened the door. "No." I grabbed his arm, panic surging through me. "What are you doing?" His expression was distant, unreadable. "We can't fight this. We never could." Sarah reached for him too. "Carter, don't." He shook us off. "They don't want us." His voice was quiet. "They want him." I felt sick. "Mark." I looked at Emily and Sarah, my heart racing. "If we give him back, does that mean we're safe?" No one had an answer. Carter took another step toward the figures. Then, the figures moved. Not forward. Not closer. They parted. A shape began emerging from the mist. A tall, twisted form. Familiar. Mark. His body was still shifting, still wrapped in shadows. But his face, his human face, was visible beneath it. And for the first time since this nightmare began, his lips parted, and he smiled. Mark's smile wasn't human. It stretched too wide, his teeth too sharp, his eyes filled with a shifting, endless darkness. Then he moved. A blur of shadows, flickering from one spot to the next, covering impossible distances in an instant. Carter didn't even have time to react. One moment he was standing in front of us, the next, Mark's tendrils wrapped around his throat. Carter's eyes widened in horror, his shotgun clattering to the pavement. "Carter." I lunged forward, but Mark's hollow gaze snapped toward me. "Run." The voice in my head wasn't Mark's anymore. It was everything. A layered, distorted chorus of whispers, pressing against my skull, forcing themselves inside. Carter let out a strangled gasp as the darkness consumed him, his body collapsing into Mark's shifting form like he had never existed. Then Mark turned back to us. Emily screamed. We ran. The road stretched ahead, endless, empty. The mist thickened, swallowing everything behind us. But Mark was still there, his presence a shadow against reality itself, flickering at the edges of our vision. "We need to find Daniel," Sarah gasped, sprinting beside me. Daniel, the ranger who had helped us before, the one who knew about the Shadow Watcher. He was the only person who might have answers. Emily stumbled, nearly falling. I grabbed her arm, pulling her up. "Keep moving." Somewhere behind us, Mark laughed. A terrible, hollow sound. The headlights of an abandoned car came into view up ahead. It was old, dented, but intact. "Get in," I shouted. We didn't hesitate. Sarah yanked the door open, throwing herself inside. Emily and I followed, slamming the doors shut just as Mark's shadow lunged toward us. I fumbled with the keys. Thank God they were still in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I floored it. The tires screeched against the pavement as we sped into the night. The road twisted through the forest, trees blurring past us. None of us spoke, too terrified to look back. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Where does Daniel live?" Sarah exhaled shakily. "I remember he mentioned a ranger station, north of the park." I gritted my teeth. "Then that's where we're going." The headlights cut through the mist, but the road felt wrong. The trees seemed taller, the sky darker, like the world itself was warping around us. Then, a shape flickered in the rearview mirror. Mark, chasing us. But he wasn't running. He was gliding, his form stretching, bending, shifting between the trees. I pressed the gas harder. The speedometer climbed. 60 miles per hour. 70. 80. But Mark was still there. Then the radio crackled. A voice. Daniel's voice. If you're hearing this, you're already too late. Daniel's voice crackled through the radio, distorted by static, but clear enough to freeze my blood. If you're hearing this, you're already too late. I gripped the wheel tighter, my heart hammering. What the hell does that mean? Sarah turned the volume up, her hands shaking. Daniel? Daniel. We're coming to you, Mark is. I know, Daniel's voice interrupted. And that's why you need to listen. The static deepened, then his voice came through again, grim and hollow. This has happened before. I exchanged a look with Emily, dread settling in my stomach. Daniel continued, his tone heavy with something like resignation. The Shadow Watcher isn't new. It's old. Older than anything we can understand. Its name has been whispered through time, from civilization to civilization. But the oldest stories, the ones few ever dared to record, they come from the Maya. My hands clenched the wheel. The Maya? You mean? Yes, Daniel said. Long before Christ, before written history, before empires fell. I swallowed hard. The Maya didn't just worship gods, Daniel continued. They feared what came before them. The road twisted ahead and I forced myself to focus. But Daniel's voice held me captive. They had many gods, but there was one they never spoke of directly. One that existed in the dark, always watching, waiting for a soul foolish enough to stray into its grasp. They called it Ektunal, the shadow that devours. Emily shuddered. It devours? Yes, Daniel confirmed. Not just bodies, souls. The Maya believed that if someone looked into the abyss too long, the abyss would look back and claim them. Sarah inhaled sharply. Like Mark. Exactly. The static flared, then settled. Daniel's voice became urgent. The Shadow Watcher doesn't just kill. It collects. It feeds on fear, on despair, on the minds of those it claims. And once it has someone, they don't just die. They become part of it. I felt sick. That's why Mark changed, Daniel pressed on. He's not Mark anymore. Not really. He's theirs now. A vessel. The car rattled as I pushed the accelerator harder. Then how do we stop it? For the first time, Daniel hesitated. Then he spoke. You don't. Silence filled the car. Sarah's breath hitched. There has to be a way. Daniel exhaled through the radio. The Maya didn't kill it. They trapped it. My fingers dug into the wheel. How? The same way they stopped it last time, Daniel said. By cutting off its host. Emily tensed. You mean Mark? Daniel's voice was grim. Yes. A horrible realization sank into my gut. To stop the Shadow Watcher, we have to kill Mark. Nobody spoke. Then Sarah whispered, but what if there's still a part of him left? Daniel's voice turned cold. There isn't. A horrible screech echoed behind us. I checked the mirror. Mark was closer. His form was less human now, his limbs stretching unnaturally, the darkness bleeding from him like smoke. His eyes locked onto mine. Daniel's voice came through, barely audible through the static. If you hesitate, you'll all die. The road ahead loomed dark, the final stretch, and we had a choice to make. Mark moved faster. The shadows around him stretched, flickering with every step. He wasn't just running, he was warping, shifting through the dark, closing the distance between us in impossible ways. I gritted my teeth, pushing the car as fast as it would go. The speedometer crept past 90 miles per hour, but no matter how fast we drove, Mark kept up. Daniel's voice crackled through the radio again. You're running out of time. Emily turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do? I didn't know. Sarah pressed her hands against her head, whispering to herself. The Maya trapped it, they trapped it, then her head shot up. Daniel, how did they do it? How did they seal it away? A brief silence. Then Daniel answered, they performed a ritual, a sacrifice. I swallowed hard. What kind of sacrifice? The host, Daniel said. They cut the host off from the Shadow Watcher before it could fully merge. They destroyed his body, his mind, everything. That's the only way. Sarah paled. You mean, we have to kill Mark before he stops being Mark completely? Mark let out a horrifying screech, his voice layered with whispers that dug into my skull like needles. The darkness around him pulsed, alive. Sarah gripped my shoulder. If we don't do it now, we lose our chance. Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. There has to be another way. Daniel's voice was firm. There isn't. The car rattled as something slammed against the trunk. Mark was on us. His twisted fingers clawed at the back of the car, his form flickering in and out of the shadows. His face, if it could even be called that anymore, stretched into something unnatural, something wrong. Stop the Sierra, Daniel ordered. I hesitated. Then Mark crawled onto the roof. A hand, long, black, shifting, punched through the metal just inches from Emily's head. Stop the damn car, Daniel shouted. I slammed the brakes. The car screeched, tires burning against the asphalt. The force sent Mark flying forward, his body tumbling across the road. This was it, our only chance. I jumped out of the car, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. Sarah and Emily followed, gasping for air. Mark lay in the road ahead, his body twitching, the shadows around him pulsing angrily. He let out a deep, guttural growl, his limbs cracking as he rose unnaturally from the pavement. His voice was layered now, no longer human. You can't stop me. Daniel's voice crackled in my ear. Now. I grabbed the tire iron from the trunk. Sarah picked up a crowbar from the roadside debris. Emily hesitated, but when she looked at Mark, at the thing he had become, she knew. There was no saving him. We rushed him. Mark screeched, lunging toward us, but we were faster. The first hit knocked him back. The second sent him to his knees. The shadows around him writhed, twisting, screaming. Emily delivered the final blow. The moment the metal cracked against his skull, the air shattered. A wave of darkness exploded outward, sending us all flying. Then silence. When I opened my eyes, the road was empty. Mark was gone, and so was the Shadow Watcher. The silence was deafening. I pushed myself up, my body aching from the blast. The road was empty, no shadows, no whispers, nothing. It was as if the darkness had been ripped from the world. Sarah groaned beside me, clutching her arm. Is it over? Emily sat up, her hands shaking. Mark, he's really gone. I didn't answer. My gaze was fixed on the blackened spot where Mark had stood just moments ago. There was nothing left of him. No body, no trace. Only the faint scent of burning air, like something had been erased from existence. Daniel's voice crackled through the radio in the car. Did you do it? I picked up the receiver with trembling fingers. It's gone. The Shadow Watcher is gone. A long silence. Then Daniel exhaled. Good. I expected relief. But all I felt was emptiness. Because no matter what we did, we had lost Mark a long time ago. We drove in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. The mist had fully cleared, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the sky was visible, gray and lifeless, but real. Emily rested her head against the window, her eyes hollow. Sarah sat stiffly, staring at her hands. I tightened my grip on the wheel. Where do we go now? Daniel hesitated on the radio. There's a safe place about 30 miles north. An old ranger station. You can rest there. Rest? Sarah muttered bitterly. Like we'll ever sleep again. Emily didn't speak. I swallowed hard. Daniel, will it come back? Static. Then Daniel spoke, quieter this time. I don't know. The words settled heavily between us, because deep down we did know. Things like the Shadow Watcher don't die. They wait. They return. And one day someone else will see it watching. The road stretched endlessly before us, empty and quiet. But something inside me wouldn't settle. I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow standing at the edge of the road, its head tilted, its hollow gaze locked onto me. I blinked. It was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself. But as I turned my eyes back to the road, one last whisper slithered through my mind. We never left. The nightmare wasn't over. It never would be. The ranger station was a forgotten relic from another time, small, wooden, barely standing against the creeping weight of the forest. We pulled in slowly, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The place looked abandoned, but Daniel was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, eyes sharp. As soon as we got out, he studied us carefully. You look like hell. Sarah let out a humorless laugh. We came from hell. Emily stayed silent, staring at the trees as if expecting something to emerge. Daniel gestured for us to follow him inside. Come on, get warm. We need to talk. The inside of the station was small but stocked. Maps, weapons, even emergency supplies. It was clear Daniel had been preparing for something like this for a long time. We sat around an old wooden table. Daniel sighed and leaned forward. Tell me everything. So we did. And as I spoke, the unease in my stomach grew. Because even though we had escaped, it didn't feel like we had won. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he exhaled deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. So you stopped Mark, he said finally. You cut off the Shadow Watcher's vessel. I nodded. Yeah. We ended it. Daniel didn't look convinced. Sarah frowned. What? Daniel hesitated. Then he leaned in. You don't stop something like this. You delay it. A cold chill ran down my spine. Emily shifted uncomfortably. What are you saying? Daniel's expression darkened. The Shadow Watcher isn't just a spirit. It's an entity older than time itself. It doesn't need one vessel. It can take another. Sarah's face paled. You mean? Daniel nodded grimly. It'll find someone else. Silence fell over the room. Then, Emily let out a slow, shaky breath. I still hear it, she whispered. My heart stopped. Sarah's head snapped toward Emily. What? Emily clutched the edge of the table, her hands trembling. The whispers. She swallowed hard. I never stopped hearing them. Daniel stood immediately, reaching for his gun. How long? Emily squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing ragged. Since we left the town. A heavy, suffocating tension filled the room. No, I muttered. No, we killed it. We stopped it. Daniel shook his head. You stopped Mark. But the Shadow Watcher? It's still here. I felt sick. Sarah backed away from Emily, fear flashing in her eyes. It's inside her? Emily let out a sharp gasp. Her hands twitched, her pupils dilating. Then she laughed. Not Emily's laugh. Something else. The lights flickered. The shadows in the room shifted. And in a voice layered with whispers, Emily looked up at us and said, You never left. The air in the ranger station changed. The temperature plummeted. The wooden walls creaked as if something massive was pressing against them. The lantern on the table flickered, casting twisting shadows that moved on their own. Emily's laughter turned into a choked gasp. She clutched her head, her body trembling violently. It's inside me, she whispered. I feel it. Daniel grabbed his shotgun, his face grim. Tell me exactly what happened at Big Sur. From the beginning. My hands shook as I tried to think back. We arrived at the campsite. Everything felt wrong from the start. The mist, the silence. Sarah was breathing heavily, realization dawning in her eyes. Mark did something. I swallowed hard. Yeah, I remember now. Emily's body stiffened. Her breath came in short gasps. He spit on it. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. And he pissed on it too. Daniel's jaw clenched. What did he spit on? I forced the words out. A stone. A huge black stone near the woods. Daniel turned pale. Oh shit. Daniel slammed the butt of his shotgun onto the table. You woke it up. Sarah's hands were shaking. What do you mean? What was that stone? Daniel's eyes were dark, haunted. That wasn't just a rock. That was a seal. The floor beneath us seemed to tremble at his words. That stone was the last thing keeping the Shadow Watcher trapped for over 3,000 years, Daniel said. The Maya didn't kill it. They couldn't. So they sealed it away beneath the land, using rituals, sacrifices, and that stone as a lock. I felt my stomach drop. And Mark had desecrated it. Laughter, low and guttural, echoed through the room. Not from Emily, but from everywhere. The shadows in the corners of the cabin stretched, curling toward us like grasping fingers. Emily let out a strangled breath. Her pupils had gone completely black. You freed me, she whispered, her voice layered, unnatural. Daniel took a step back, his gun shaking in his grip. It's too late. Sarah's eyes filled with horror. No, there has to be a way to fix this. Emily, no, the Shadow Watcher, tilted her head unnaturally. There is no fixing it, she said softly. Only joining. Then the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the room. Sarah screamed. The walls groaned, bending inward as if the cabin itself was being crushed. The air turned thick, suffocating, filled with whispers that burrowed into my skull. Daniel fired his shotgun. The flash of the blast illuminated Emily's face for half a second. Her mouth stretched impossibly wide, black veins crawling up her skin, her eyes nothing but swirling voids. Then the light disappeared. I reached out blindly, grabbing Sarah's hand. We need to run. The floor trembled beneath us. The voices grew, overlapping, 1,000 whispers becoming a roar. Then something cold wrapped around my ankle. I gasped, kicking wildly, but it tightened, an inky black tendril dragging me into the dark. Sarah and Daniel grabbed my arms, pulling. Don't let it take him. Sarah screamed. The Shadow Watcher laughed. You can't escape. The tendrils pulled harder. And I realized with horror that it wasn't just trying to drag me into the dark. It was trying to drag me back to Big Sur. The tendrils yanked me harder, my body sliding across the wooden floor. The darkness around me shifted, warping the space between us. I wasn't just being pulled, I was being transported. Flashes of mist, the towering redwoods, the cursed stone, slick with rain and desecration. It was dragging me back to Big Sur. Sarah screamed, tightening her grip on my arm. Hold on. Daniel cursed under his breath, raising his shotgun. Get out of him. He fired, once, twice, but the buckshot disappeared into the void. The Shadow Watcher laughed. The tendrils wrapped around my torso now, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My vision blurred, my body going numb. Then Sarah did something insane. She grabbed the lantern from the table and smashed it onto the floor, igniting the spilled oil into a sudden blaze. The fire roared to life, casting violent shadows against the walls. The tendrils recoiled. The hold on my body weakened. Daniel saw the opening. He lunged forward, slamming the butt of his gun against my chest, forcing me free from the Shadow Watcher's grip. I gasped, coughing, clawing at the wooden floor. We weren't safe yet. Emily, or what was left of Emily, stood in the center of the room, her body twitching unnaturally. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing shifting shadows beneath her skin, writhing like a nest of snakes. The Shadow Watcher wasn't just using her, it was becoming her. Her lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile. You delay the inevitable. The cabin shook. The walls groaned, bending inward. The fire flickered, struggling against the darkness that swirled around us. Daniel pulled me to my feet. We have to go. Sarah was already at the door, trying to wrench it open. It won't budge. The shadow watcher tilted its head. You are mine now. Then it lunged. Sarah screamed. Daniel raised his gun, but the creature was too fast. It was going to take her. No. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a burning piece of wood from the floor, and swung. The fire connected with Emily's body. She shrieked. The cabin exploded with light. The moment the flame touched her, the shadow watcher reeled back, a horrible, inhuman screech splitting the air. The darkness shattered, peeling away from Emily's body like smoke caught in the wind. The tendrils lashed wildly, but they were retreating. The fire. It hated the fire. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed another burning plank and hurled it at the wall, sending more flames roaring upward. The cabin was turning into an inferno, but the shadows were breaking apart. Emily let out a choked sob. Her body twitched violently as if something inside her was fighting to stay. Please? Her voice cracked. Sarah reached for her. Emily? Then Emily screamed. A final, violent convulsion, and then the shadow watcher tore itself free. The darkness ripped out of her body, unraveling into the air, shrieking as it was forced from this world. The walls trembled, the fire roared, and with one final earth-shaking screech, the shadow watcher was gone. Emily collapsed, and the world went silent. 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, there was a king whose name was feared across continents. A ruler so merciless that even his own people whispered his name only in the darkest hours of the night. His name was Nine Cattle, the Blood King. He did not seek gold. He did not seek land. He sought something far greater, immortality. Legends say that he bathed in the blood of his enemies, believing it would make him stronger. He razed entire villages, leaving no survivors, ensuring that none remained to whisper curses against his name. But it was not enough. His body continued to wither. His bones grew weak. Time did not favor even the mightiest of rulers. And so, in his desperation, he turned to the darkest forces of the world. His priests spoke of an entity, one older than time, a being that lurked in the void between worlds. A watcher waiting in the shadows for a worthy vessel. A god of whispers, a god of death, a god that could grant him eternity. Nine Cattle did not hesitate. He ordered his priests to perform a ritual unlike any seen before, a ceremony drenched in blood and suffering. He commanded that all his prisoners, thousands of men, women, and children, be brought to the temple. One by one, they were sacrificed beneath the black stone altar. Their screams filled the night, their blood soaking into the earth, feeding something beneath the temple, something waiting. As the last victim fell, the sky darkened. The air grew thick with shadows. The temple walls trembled as an unnatural wind howled through the land. And then silence. The priests fell to their knees. The stars above vanished, swallowed by an abyss deeper than night itself. And from the darkness, a voice spoke, not in words, not in sound, in whispers. Nine Cattle stepped forward, arms outstretched. I offer you everything, he declared. Make me eternal. The shadows shifted. They watched, and then they answered. The next morning, 9 Catalyst men entered the temple to find their king changed. His body was no longer flesh and bone. It was darkness, shifting and writhing beneath his skin. His eyes, once golden like the sun, had turned into black voids. He had become more than human. The Blood King did not age. He did not weaken. But his hunger grew. He realized his immortality came at a cost. He needed more blood, more souls. And so his empire fell into madness. His warriors raided not for land, not for wealth, but for bodies. Entire civilizations disappeared, swallowed into the void, their essence feeding the thing that lived within the king. But immortality is not without its end. The priests, terrified by what they had unleashed, betrayed their master. They crafted a great seal, a sacred stone imbued with the last remnants of their dying gods. And in the dead of night, they lured 9 cattle to the altar where he had first offered his soul. They trapped him. They buried the temple. And they left a warning. He watches. He waits. Do not wake him. But 1,000 years later, someone did. The priest's warning was buried with the temple, lost to time as civilizations rose and fell. The name 9 Cattle faded from history, his cursed empire forgotten. But the Shadow Watcher, his gift, his curse, remained. For centuries the seal held. The ancient stone, etched with sacred symbols, bound the darkness beneath the earth, keeping it from spreading. Until one mistake undid it all. Until a careless man, thousands of years later, spat and pissed on the very thing meant to hold it back. Mark had desecrated the seal. And now the Blood King's hunger had returned. He had waited long enough. Far from the ruins of his lost kingdom, the Shadow Watcher stirred. It was no longer bound to temples or ancient bloodlines. It had tasted new souls, new fears. And it was learning. The form it once took, the form of 9 cattle, was no longer necessary. The world had changed. The gods of old were forgotten. But humanity was still the same. Still weak. Still desperate. Still afraid. The Shadow Watcher did not need an empire. It did not need warriors. It only needed one willing vessel. A host to carry it forward. It had found one in Mark. But now Mark was gone, which meant it needed someone new. The truck rumbled down the empty highway. The flames of the burning ranger station still flickered in the distance, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. Sarah clutched her arms, shivering despite the heat. "It's over," she whispered, as if saying it would make it true. Daniel didn't answer. His grip on the wheel was tight, his expression unreadable. Emily sat in the back, staring blankly out the window. She had barely spoken since the fire, since the Shadow Watcher had been forced from her body. I swallowed hard. "Daniel, tell me the truth." He didn't look at me. I pressed on. "If the Shadow Watcher can't be killed, then where is it now?" Silence. Then Emily spoke. Soft. "Hollow. It's waiting." I turned, dread pooling in my stomach. Emily's lips curled into the faintest smile. And when she looked at me, her pupils were still black. 9 cattle had become unstoppable. What had once been a mighty king was now something far worse. A living shadow, a being of hunger and death. The more he consumed, the less of him remained human. His form shifted, his body twisting like smoke caught in the wind, his voice layered with whispers from the abyss. His people, once loyal and obedient, began to fear him. The Blood King no longer ruled, he devoured. Entire villages disappeared overnight. The land itself began to rot, the rivers running black, the forests withering under an unseen curse. His warriors abandoned him. His priests begged for mercy. But 9 cattle had no use for cowards. He dragged them into the darkness, their screams echoing for days before silence fell once more. Then the remaining few realized they couldn't serve him. They had to stop him. It took years to plan. Ix cattle no longer needed rest, no longer needed food. He was always watching, always listening. But his hunger was growing, his need to consume greater than ever before. So his people devised a trap. They sent a delegation, his last loyal warriors, who begged for an audience with their king. They brought offerings of blood and gold, promising an even greater sacrifice deep in the caves beyond his temple. Curious, the Blood King followed. But when he reached the depths of the cavern, something changed. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the ground covered in ancient glyphs carved by trembling hands. A seal. Realizing too late, 9 cattle turned, only to see his own people standing at the entrance, their faces grim. They collapsed the cave. Stone by stone they buried him. They chanted the old prayers, the last remnants of their dying gods, binding him beneath the earth where no blood could reach him. The walls of the cavern groaned as the rocks fell, sealing the Blood King in his tomb. For days the ground trembled. The voices in the wind howled in rage. Then silence. The Shadow Watcher was trapped. The kingdom, once cursed and dying, was abandoned. The survivors fled across the ocean, leaving behind only warnings carved into stone, desperate messages to those who would come after them. Do not wake him. For over 3,000 years the seal held, until the day Mark arrived, and pissed on the grave of a god. The mist outside shifted, not with the wind, not with movement. It reacted to his words, like it was alive, like it was listening. I swallowed hard. Mark, what's going on? He smiled. The shadows beneath his skin writhed. Don't you get it? He whispered. We never left. The engine died. The lights flickered and went dark. Silence. A deep, endless silence that pressed against my ears, against my skull, against the very air in my lungs. Sarah whimpered. Turn it back on. Please. I turned the key. Nothing. Outside, the mist twisted, curling around the RV like grasping fingers. Emily clutched my arm. This isn't real. It can't be real. Mark's laughter was soft. Please. You woke something up, he murmured. And now it knows you. His pupils dilated, swallowing the color of his eyes until they were pitch-black voids. A whisper slid through the mist, slithering into my mind. You belong to me now. And then the doors unlocked themselves. The RV doors clicked open on their own. Cold air rushed in, carrying the thick scent of damp earth and something rotting. The mist curled inside, wrapping around my legs, slithering like it had a mind of its own. Mark didn't move. He just sat there, his blackened eyes staring straight ahead. He wasn't breathing. He wasn't blinking. Sarah whimpered. We have to go. Emily was frozen, gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. I reached for the keys again. Twisted. Nothing. The radio flickered back to life, but it wasn't playing static this time. It was playing a voice. Mark's voice. You can't run. Mark twitched. His head snapped toward me, his mouth stretching into something that wasn't a smile. They're here. And then his body jerked violently, as if something was being ripped out of him. Mark screamed. Not in pain, not in fear, but like something was dragging him back into the abyss. His body convulsed, his arms clawing at the seat, at the air, at nothing. Black smoke poured from his mouth, his nose, his eyes, seeping from every part of him like something escaping. The RV shook. The lights flickered. The shadow tore itself from his body. Mark let out a final, choked breath, his body collapsing against the seat, lifeless. The mist outside shrieked. It recoiled. The darkness fled. Sarah sobbed, clutching Emily as Mark's empty body slumped forward, his head lolling unnaturally to the side. His face, once twisted with something inhuman, looked peaceful now. For the first time in days, the whisper stopped. Mark was dead. The silence was suffocating. Sarah pressed her hands over her mouth, shaking. Emily buried her face in her hands. I could still hear the echo of his voice in my skull. The words he had spoken when he was still himself. You woke something up. I swallowed hard, staring at his unmoving body. The RV's interior was eerily still. The mist outside had begun to thin. The suffocating weight in the air had lifted, just barely. Sarah whispered, Is it gone? I turned toward the window. The trees stood tall, the forest stretching endlessly in all directions. The night was quiet, too quiet. And then, in the distance, a single figure stood in the fog. So, silent, watching. It wasn't Mark anymore, but something else had taken his place. The figure in the fog didn't move. It stood at the edge of the trees, just barely visible through the thinning mist. Sarah clutched my arm. It's still here, she whispered. Daniel tightened his grip on his shotgun. His face was pale but determined. We end this tonight. Emily shook her head violently. We can't fight it. You saw what it did to Mark. I swallowed hard. We don't have a choice. Mark had been its vessel, its way back into this world. But now he was dead. And yet, the Shadow Watcher hadn't vanished. It had only shifted. It was still here, and it was still watching us. Daniel took a deep breath. The Maya sealed it away once. We do the same. We send it back. Sarah's hands trembled. How? Daniel locked eyes with me. We need to find the stone, the ancient seal, the one Mark had desecrated, the only thing strong enough to trap the Shadow Watcher again. We ran. The forest loomed around us, the night pressing in. The mist was retreating, but the presence of the Shadow Watcher was everywhere. It whispered from the trees. It slithered beneath our skin. You cannot stop me. Emily gasped, stumbling forward. It's inside my head. Daniel grabbed her. Fight it. Keep moving. The stone wasn't far now. We had seen it that first night, half buried in the earth near our campsite. The place where everything had started. The closer we got, the heavier the air became. Like reality itself was resisting us. The trees groaned. The ground trembled beneath our feet. And then, Sarah screamed. The Shadow Watcher appeared before us, rising from the darkness like a figure stepping through a veil. The seal had lasted for millennia. Through storms, earthquakes, and the rise and fall of civilizations, it had remained untouched. Until Mark. Until his careless, drunken laughter echoed through the trees. Until his spit hit the surface of the ancient stone. Until he pissed on the final remnants of a warning lost to time. And that was all it took. The ground trembled beneath him, the forest holding its breath. For the first time in over 3,000 years, something beneath the earth stirred. A whisper soft as the wind. A sigh from the abyss. Then silence. Mark laughed, completely unaware of what he had done. The others called for him to hurry back to the RV. And the Shadow Watcher opened its eyes. That night, as they sat around the campfire, Mark felt it first. A strange itch beneath his skin. He rubbed his arms, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It moved, crawling up his spine, pressing into his skull. The others laughed and told stories. Emily poured drinks. Sarah shivered, glancing uneasily into the woods. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling. Something was watching them. Something was watching him. Then the whisper came. Soft, gentle, ancient. You freed me. Mark's breath hitched. He turned sharply, staring into the trees. Nothing was there. But the whisper came again. Now you are mine. From that moment on, Mark was no longer alone. The others didn't notice at first. How his laughter became hollow. How his reflection sometimes lingered a second too long in the RV mirror. How, when he spoke, his voice almost sounded layered, like something else was speaking with him. Sarah noticed. She was the first to sense that something about Mark had changed. That his shadow in the firelight didn't always move the way it should. That sometimes in the middle of the night she could hear him whispering in his sleep, words in a language no human should know. That once she woke up to find him standing over her, completely still, his blackened eyes staring down at her in the dark. And then, as quickly as it happened, he turned and walked away, like he had never been there at all. Sarah should have said something. She should have woken Emily, should have told me, should have grabbed the keys to the RV and left right then and there. But she didn't. Because when Mark turned to look at her that night, when his eyes met hers, something pressed against her mind. A feeling, a command, a whisper that slithered into her thoughts like oil. You will forget. And she did. By morning, the memory had faded like a half-remembered dream. Mark smiled over breakfast, laughing with Emily, sipping coffee as if nothing was wrong. Sarah told herself she had imagined it, until she saw the bruises on her wrists, like something had held her down in her sleep. The drive out of Big Sur should have been easy. The trip was supposed to be over. But Mark sat in the passenger seat, silent. His fingers tapped against his leg in an erratic rhythm, his gaze unfocused, staring out the window at nothing. Emily was the first to ask, "Hey, you good?" Mark blinked, turning toward her too slowly. His smile was a second too late. "Yeah, just tired." His voice sounded off, flat. empty, like someone pretending to be human. Sarah's hands tightened in her lap. The bruises on her wrists throbbed. She opened her mouth. She was going to say something, going to tell me that something was wrong. But then Mark looked at her, and the words died in her throat. It wasn't Mark sitting in that seat anymore. Not really. Something inside him was awake now. Something that had been waiting beneath the earth for 3,000 years. It had watched civilizations crumble. It had waited through the rise and fall of empires. And now it had him. Mark turned back toward the road, humming an old, unfamiliar tune. A melody from a time long before any of us existed. Before Sarah could say anything, the mist rolled in. Thick, heavy, unnatural. And just like that, we were never meant to leave. The mist swallowed everything. The trees, the road, even the sky above, it all vanished into a suffocating gray void. The headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead before the world was lost to shadow. I slowed the RV. My fingers were tight on the wheel, my knuckles white. What the hell is this? No one answered. Mark sat still in the passenger seat, his face unreadable. Emily leaned forward, peering into the mist. Is this fog normal? Sarah's breath hitched. No. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. We had driven this road before. There had been no mist, no unnatural silence, no feeling of something watching us from just beyond our sight. Mark exhaled slowly, almost in amusement. We're not supposed to leave. His voice was wrong. It was layered, like two voices speaking at once. I slammed the brakes. The RV jerked to a stop. The engine rumbled softly, but everything outside was pure, consuming fog. Sarah's hands trembled. We need to turn around. Emily nodded quickly. Yeah, let's go back to the park. No, Mark interrupted. We all turned to him. His head tilted slightly, his expression eerily calm. There is no back. A chill ran down my spine. Sarah reached for the door handle. I need some air. Mark's fingers twitched. You don't want to do that. Sarah froze. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was taller, stronger, its limbs stretched into impossible angles, its face a swirling void of hunger. Daniel raised his shotgun. It laughed. The forest exploded into chaos. A gust of unnatural wind sent us flying backward. The trees bent, groaning under an unseen force. The whispers turned into screams. Sarah clutched her ears, her face twisted in pain. Emily sobbed, shaking her head violently. You are nothing. The Shadow Watcher's voice pounded in my skull. You belong to me. I forced myself up, coughing. Daniel. The stone. Daniel was already moving, dragging Emily with him. Cover us. Sarah and I turned to face the thing. It loomed over us, darkness writhing around its body. I grabbed a burning branch from the ground and swung. The fire connected. The Shadow Watcher reeled back, its form flickering. It felt that. Daniel reached the stone, his hands scraping against the ancient carvings. Sarah. The blood ritual. We need a sacrifice. Sarah's face paled. A sacrifice? Daniel's expression was grim. That's how they sealed it last time. I looked down at the dagger Daniel had pulled from his belt. The blade was old, older than any of us. The price to trap the Shadow Watcher was clear, and one of us had to pay it. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached beneath his shirt, pulling out a pendant I had never seen before. A small, ancient-looking vial hung from the chain, its glass darkened with age. Inside, a faint shimmer of liquid swirled, glowing dimly even in the shadows. Sarah gasped. What is that? Daniel's grip tightened around it. Holy water. Emily shook her head, confused. From where? Daniel exhaled slowly. From my ancestors. His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw something that had been buried deep for generations. A truth even he had barely believed until now. My family, he whispered. We were Maya. Silence fell. The wind howled through the trees. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. My ancestors were the ones who sealed him away. They were chosen to guard the stone, to ensure 9 cattle never returned. This, he held up the vial, was blessed before the temple fell. The last remnants of the ritual that trapped him. My breath caught. Then this can work? Daniel's eyes burned with purpose. It has to. Behind us the Shadow Watcher roared. The trees bent and twisted, the very air around us warping as the darkness screamed. The thing that had once been 9 cattle knew what Daniel held. It feared it. Emily backed away, shaking. What do we do? Daniel moved fast. We finish what my ancestors started. The ancient stone lay before us, cracked but still covered in the faded carvings of a forgotten ritual. The seal was weak, broken by Mark's mistake, but not beyond repair. Daniel stepped forward, uncorking the vial. The liquid inside shimmered, reflecting light that wasn't even there. The Shadow Watcher lunged. I grabbed Sarah and pulled her down just as the thing's elongated arms slammed into the earth beside us. The ground quaked, splitting apart as the shadows writhed. Daniel threw the holy water onto the stone. The effect was instantaneous. The carvings lit up, glowing with a golden energy that shot into the air like fire bursting from the ground. The Shadow Watcher screamed. The darkness ripped apart. Tendrils of shadow flailed wildly, retreating, fighting the pull of the ancient magic now awakening in the stone. Daniel shouted in Maya, his voice powerful, commanding. 9 cattle. Tain kan ukial. 9 cattle. Return to the abyss. The forest howled. The mist coiled, twisting violently as the Shadow Watcher was dragged toward the seal. It clawed at the earth, resisting, its hollow face twisting in rage. The whispers screeched, trying to crawl back into our minds, but the holy water burned away its grip. Sarah pressed against me, tears streaming down her face. It's working. Emily sobbed, clutching Daniel's arm. The Shadow Watcher let out one final, piercing wail. Then, with a deafening crack, the stone sealed itself. A shockwave of golden light erupted outward, knocking us all to the ground. The air shimmered, vibrating with an ancient force. And then, silence. The Shadow Watcher was gone. The golden light began to fade, the carvings on the ancient stone pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The ritual was working, but 9 cattle was resisting. The shadows writhed, clawing at the edges of the seal, trying to slither free. The air was thick with whispers, no longer seductive but desperate, enraged. Daniel gritted his teeth, holding his hand over the stone, chanting in the ancient Maya tongue. The pendant around his neck glowed brighter, reacting to the sacred energy. Then the ground shook violently. A surge of darkness erupted from the stone, lashing out like a serpent striking its prey. Daniel barely had time to react before the tendril of pure shadow wrapped around his left arm. Sarah screamed. Daniel? The darkness pulled. Daniel roared in agony as the tendril twisted, sinking into his flesh like burning tar. The shadows hissed, fighting back, refusing to be sealed again. I lunged forward, trying to grab him. Then, with a sickening snap, the tendril ripped his arm clean off. Daniel collapsed to the ground, blood pouring from the stump where his arm had been. His face twisted in pain, but he didn't scream. He refused to scream. The shadows reared back, thrashing violently, but the holy water was still burning them, forcing them back into the stone. Daniel clenched his teeth, his remaining hand pressing against the seal. I won't let you win. The stone trembled beneath him, cracks forming along its surface as 9 cattle fought with everything it had left. Emily fell to her knees beside Daniel, desperately pressing against his wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Daniel, stay with us, please. His breathing was ragged, but his eyes never left the stone. The pendant around his neck pulsed one last time. Daniel grabbed it, his face set with determination. This ends now. With the last of his strength, he slammed the pendant into the center of the stone. A brilliant golden light exploded outward. The world shattered. A wave of energy ripped through the forest, the mist howling as it was sucked into the seal. The ground shook, the air vibrated, and for a brief, terrible moment, I thought we would all be pulled into the abyss with it. The Shadow Watcher, 9 cattle, screamed. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a sound meant for this world. A final wail of rage, of loss, of defeat. Then, the stone sealed itself. The golden light faded. The wind stopped. The tree stood still. It was over. Daniel slumped forward, barely conscious, his body trembling from the blood loss. Emily sobbed, pressing her hands to his chest. Stay with us. You're going to be okay. Sarah fell to the ground, gasping. I turned to the stone, still glowing faintly. The whispers were gone. The presence was gone. 9 cattle, the Shadow Watcher, was trapped once more. But at what cost? Daniel's breathing was shallow, his face pale from blood loss. His left arm, what was left of it, was wrapped hastily in torn fabric, but the wound was severe. Emily pressed her hands against his chest, her fingers trembling. We need to stop the bleeding, he's losing too much. Sarah ripped the sleeve from her jacket, tying it around the wound as tightly as she could. Stay with us, Daniel. His lips curled into a weak smile. I'm not dying today. His voice was faint but steady. I turned toward the ancient stone. The glow had faded, leaving behind only the cold, cracked surface. The last remnants of 9 cattle had been sealed. The forest was silent. No whispers, no shifting shadows. Just the stillness of a world that had won. But I couldn't shake the unease in my chest. We had done it, but for how long? I helped Daniel sit up, careful not to jostle his wound. His face was tight with pain, but his eyes were clear. It's over, Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Emily sat back, wiping her tears. It has to be. I looked at the stone, at the carvings, at the remnants of the ritual that had cost Daniel so much. For centuries, the Maya had guarded this place, ensuring that the Shadow Watcher remained buried. Then we had come along. Mark had been careless, and now Daniel had paid the price for fixing our mistake. I exhaled slowly. We need to make sure no one ever finds this again. Daniel nodded weakly. Bury it, hide it, do whatever it takes. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. What if one day it wakes up again? Silence. Then Daniel's tired smile returned. Then someone will have to stop it again. We spent the next few hours doing what had to be done. Covering the stone with rocks, dirt, anything we could find. Making it look like it had never been touched. By the time we finished, the sky was turning gray with the first signs of dawn. The nightmare was over. Emily stood back, staring at the burial site. If anyone finds this again, they won't, I said firmly. Daniel gave me a knowing look but said nothing. The truth was we had done everything we could. But some things don't stay buried forever. As we walked back toward the wreckage of our RV, I felt it, just for a second. A single whisper, a breath of cold air. Watching, waiting, for the next fool to wake it up. Daniel was barely conscious. His breathing was ragged, his skin clammy. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage on his severed arm, and I knew we didn't have much time before he passed out completely. But we weren't done yet. The Shadow Watcher might have been trapped, but the seal was still weak. The ancient stone had been damaged, cracked, and if we didn't reinforce it, the thing inside would find a way to escape again. I dropped to my knees beside the stone, my hands scraping against its rough surface. The carvings were faint, barely visible under the dirt and ash. I turned to Daniel. What do I do? Daniel groaned, forcing his eyes open. His good hand trembled as he reached for the vial of holy water around his neck, the last drops left from his ancestors. He pressed it into my hand. Use this. Emily gasped. But that's all you have left. Daniel gave her a weak, knowing smile. Then let's make it count. I uncorked the vial, my hands shaking. The liquid inside shimmered faintly as if it knew what it was meant to do. I turned back to the stone. "Tell me what to say." My voice was hoarse, desperate. Daniel inhaled sharply, gathering what little strength he had left. Then he began to speak, not in English but in the ancient tongue of his ancestors. "Kan tun yako tizi." Seal the stone with fire. "Jakanik sikau." Banish the dark one. I repeated the words, my voice unsteady. The air around us shifted, the shadows curling away as if fearing the incantation. Then, with one final breath, I poured the holy water over the stone. The moment the liquid touched the surface, the carvings lit up, glowing with a fierce, golden light. The ground trembled beneath us, and then the stone sealed itself. The cracks vanished. The glow faded. The Shadow Watcher was trapped once more. The forest fell silent. No whispers. No movement. No shadows stretching where they shouldn't. Emily exhaled shakily, falling to her knees. "Is it gone?" Daniel sagged against Sarah, barely able to hold himself upright. He was too weak to answer, but I saw it in his eyes. We had done it. I ran my hand over the stone one last time. The carvings were whole again, the ancient power restored. Sarah stared at me. "Will it hold?" I swallowed. For now. We had stopped it. But as I stood, looking at the sacred stone, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing stays buried forever. One day someone would come. Someone would wake it up again. And when that day came, I only hoped someone like Daniel would be there to stop it. The stone was whole again. The final drops of Daniel's sacred water had sealed the cracks, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air around us felt still. No more whispers. No more shifting shadows. 9 cattle was trapped. Daniel slumped against me, his body weak from blood loss. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Sarah and Emily sat on the ground beside us, exhausted, their eyes locked onto the ancient stone as if expecting it to crack open at any second. It didn't. It was over. Emily wiped at her face, smearing dirt and tears across her cheeks. We actually did it. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. For how long? None of us had an answer. But for now, the Blood King was where he belonged, buried beneath the earth, his hunger trapped in darkness. And as long as we lived, we would make sure it stayed that way. The sun had begun to rise, its first light cutting through the mist. We had survived the night. I helped Daniel to his feet, supporting his weight as best as I could. His face was pale, his body trembling, but his eyes still burned with determination. "We need to cover the stone," he muttered weakly. Sarah nodded, already gathering rocks, dirt, anything to make sure no one else would ever find it. Emily joined her, stacking debris over the ancient seal. We worked in silence, our bodies moving on pure instinct, exhaustion pulling at every limb. By the time we were finished, the sacred stone was hidden beneath layers of earth and rubble. I exhaled, wiping sweat from my forehead. No one will ever find it. Daniel managed a weak smile. "Let's hope you're right." As we stood there, staring at the buried stone, I felt something deep inside me, something I hadn't felt since we arrived in Big Sur. For the first time, the forest felt normal. The air was lighter. The weight of unseen eyes was gone. Emily leaned against Sarah, her face turned toward the morning sky. "It's finally over." Daniel let out a breath. For now, we knew the truth. Nothing stayed buried forever. But we had stopped it, and as long as we lived, we would never let it be unleashed again. Without another word, we turned away from the site, leaving the cursed grave behind. And we never looked back. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Daniel was slipping in and out of consciousness in the back seat, his face pale from blood loss. Emily pressed a jacket against his wound, whispering words of reassurance, though her voice shook. Sarah sat beside me in the front, staring blankly out the window. The weight of everything we had been through hung between us, heavy and suffocating. The forest was far behind us now, but the memories clung to our skin like dirt we could never wash away. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, there were no shadows lurking at the edges of our vision. No whispers. No unseen eyes following our every move. 9 cattle was gone. Mark was gone. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening in her lap. "He didn't deserve that," she murmured. I didn't have to ask who she meant. Mark. Our friend who had laughed the loudest. Who had never believed in ghosts or curses, until he had become one. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the wheel. I know. We reached the hospital just as the first light of morning touched the sky. Daniel was rushed inside, the doctors barely asking questions as they wheeled him away. Emily followed close behind, her face pale, her hands still covered in his blood. Sarah and I stayed outside. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the quiet streets. I stepped beside her, neither of us speaking. For a long moment we just watched. "I keep thinking," she whispered finally, "what if we had stopped him sooner?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know what to say. Would it have mattered? Would anything have changed? Or had Mark's fate been sealed the moment he touched that cursed stone? Sarah exhaled, her breath shaky. "I miss him." I nodded. "Me too." We stood there, side by side, as the sun continued to rise. Emily found us a few minutes later. She didn't say anything, just walked up beside me and wrapped her arms tightly around my right arm, pressing her forehead against my shoulder. I felt the warmth of her breath, the slight tremble in her fingers. I didn't pull away. Sarah let out one last deep sigh, then wiped at her eyes, giving me a small, tired smile. Emily tightened her grip on my arm, as if afraid that if she let go, the darkness would return. I glanced at the hospital, knowing Daniel was fighting to recover inside. I thought about the forest, the stone, the monster we had buried. The nightmare was over, but it would always be a part of us. We had survived, and now all we could do was move forward. As the sun rose higher, washing away the shadows of the night, we turned and walked inside, together. The end.